Yep, so there is a particular relationship between the price of raw materials and the price of manufactured goods, which means that comparative advantage does not necessarily ensure that you appropriate the gains from trade.
The relationship between the price of raw goods and what,
And manufactured goods.
Can you explain that again?
Yep, so the Prebisch-Singer thesis states that the terms of trade between raw materials and manufactured goods deteriorates over time. So effectively, if you continue to export bananas on the assumption that a given amount of banana exports will give you enough export receipts to fund a given amount of the import of cars, this is false, because over time bananas will tend to decrease in price relative to cars, so therefore you'll have to export more and more raw materials to fund the same amount of imports. Yes, yep. So the assumption there is that poorer countries are poor because they lack industry.
Does that got to do with the organic composition of capital?
That would be more in terms of sort of manufacturing and how labour intensive a particular industry is. So extractive industry is not the same universally, for example. So extractive industry in the Bowen Basin in Australia, where we dig up lots of coal, or in the Pilbara region, for example, where we dig up lots of iron ore, is completely different to the extraction of the same minerals in Brazil or in South Africa or in Ghana, because it's more labour intensive in less developed countries, because they don't have the capital to secure the kind of technological innovation that you need to have capital intensive industry. And in this sense, the organic composition of capital would be affected. The organic composition of capital, of course, is the ratio of constant to variable capital, so of fixed goods, so capital goods, machinery and so on, relative to labour. Okay, so do you have lots of people working to dig up coal? So are we talking about coal mines in the old Adam Smith sense, where you're sending people down a shaft and they're digging up the coal with shovels and pickaxes and whatnot? Or are we talking about the Bowen Basin, where you have one person operating this huge machine where you detonate thousands of tons of dynamite to blow the stuff up, and then you get this machine that comes in and drags all the coal up? So one being lots of machinery used to dig up lots of material, the other one being lots of labour power used to dig up the same amount of material. So yes, it does relate to the organic composition of capital, but not necessarily in terms of the primary to...
But more just in the fact how it deteriorates over time. It's kind of creating its own like it's creating its own...
Yeah.
So it's always like, of course, like people working with taxes are going to progress to a more like need more materials over time, more machinery, which will then increase the amount of machinery needed per person.
Yep. Okay.
If you were going to say within Christian Ship,
Mm.
you're going to have three. Your argument, your thesis is yes.
Three.
You're going to have, just say a thesis is like.
Yep.
So you're
Yep.
not going to write that, but so you would have like a rich singer as that would be like an argument, one whole paragraph or one whole page. At the terms of trade.
Mm. Yep. Yes. Yep. So the Prebisch-Singer thesis would then be a mechanism that facilitates the structural impediments to development. So, yep. Again, it depends on the argument that you're making, but I would say tentatively yes, because we are asking you to demonstrate your understanding, your knowledge of particular concepts or arguments that have been put forward in relation to these questions. So, for example, I'll give you, here's one way to approach this question. If I was going to write this question, if I was going to respond to question 2, I would say, yes, trade does systemically disadvantage poorer countries, but the question is why? And then I would go into the three prevailing reasons. So I would talk about liberal trade theories, which responds no, it doesn't systemically disadvantage poor countries. One, because it is methodologically constrained in the sense that it can't conceive of the system as a whole. It's talking about country interactions as individual entities. I would then talk about the neo-mercantilist scholarship, and I would then talk about the dependency theory scholarship. And I would frame this thesis statement around one particular question. Can you catch up? So the mercantilists respond yes. The mercantilists say catch up is possible. The mercantilists say that poorer countries can indeed become high-income countries through a process of strategic tariff barriers, strategic industrial development policy, okay, employing the infant industry argument. The dependency theory school suggests that catch-up is impossible because the International Division of Labour is structured in such a way that there are impediments to the industrial development of poorer countries. Indeed, according to the dependency theory perspective, high-income countries require low-income countries to exist, okay, because the ability to industrialise is furnished by the export of resources from primary producers. So therefore, it is in the interest of the system to ensure that low-income countries remain poor. This is Andre Gunder Frank's The Development of Underdevelopment. Okay, so in this sense, I've put forward a statement. Yes, poorer countries are at a structural disadvantage, but this does not go far enough. And this is where I would be quite provocative, and I would say, but of all the extant theories, liberal trade theory, mercantilist theory, and dependency theory, they still don't adequately respond to this question within the context of some example that I'd pick, Venezuela, Thailand, whatever you want. Just pick a low-income country and go with it. I would say that all three perspectives take the country, the nation-state, as the object of analysis and are therefore fundamentally flawed at the level of methodology. How can we understand the problem of structural disadvantages or structural impediments of economic development if we take the nation-state as the object of analysis? Because the thing that pervades, that intersects, that permeates the nation-state itself within the context of the International Division of Labour is class. Okay, within and between countries, there are class structures that both facilitate and mitigate, sometimes simultaneously, development. Therefore, the nation-state is subsumed to class antagonisms. And this is the critique that I would offer. Now that's one view, but that's an example of an argument. Okay? The argument is, yes, in response to the question, but why? And then you would survey critically or critically engage with the extant scholarship, and then you would take it further by reiterating the claim within the context of what you've just done through the critical engagement. And that's a 500-word response. Well, it's probably a bit more than 500 words, but you get what I'm saying.
That sounds like really good. I'm just wondering how, so if I was going to talk about liberal trade theory,
Yep.
how would I be placing this within an argument of no, they can't catch up. It does disadvantage poorer people, poorer countries, and because viewing it as a nation state, nation states interacting with nation states is not adequate with regards to class. How would I be discussing liberal trade theory as an argument which proves that?
You would say that according to liberal trade theory, specialising in your factor endowment completely vitiates the problem in the first place. So the methodological investment in the nation state. So liberal trade theory does not permit the scope to ask these questions about structural disadvantage at the systemic level. You can't ask the question about systemic structural disadvantage within a methodology that does not acknowledge that there is a structure.
With that answer that you just gave, why wouldn't you just talk about the theory that says that class is that's unit of analysis instead of just arguing for it?
because you're responding directly to this question about the systemic disadvantage. If you're just going to talk about class, then you need to tie it into the systemic disadvantage stuff, and I would do that through the extant theory. Yeah, and I mean, you could write that essay, but you've got to make it relevant to the content that we've discussed in the course. So that's when you're thinking about this stuff, whatever it is that you argue, and look, I am completely biased. You know where my prejudices lie. Okay, don't be hoodwinked by my Marxist propaganda. That's one view. It's not a prescriptive view. We're not sitting here saying, "Oh, have you argued a good liberal trade theory perspective?" I mean, I don't care. It's more about how you've substantiated the argument and the claims. So you could write a class analysis on the basis of Harvey versus Robinson or whatever you want, as long as you're engaging with what the question is asked within the context of this unit of study. Yeah. So there are particular antagonisms within the literature that we're asking you to engage.
Are all of those three
The liberal trade theory, the mercantilist theory, and the dependency theory, they are contending approaches. Yep, so Prebisch-Singer is broadly Keynesian, dependency theory is broadly Marxist, and liberal trade theory is broadly, what you would call neoclassical or whatever. No. Neo-mercantilism, broadly Keynesian, so yeah, there are distinctions there. Yep, so it's an extension, a critical extension. But, I mean, so again, they are distinguished along that question. Prebisch and Singer believed catch-up was possible. Andre Gunder Frank denied that possibility. So that's how you would distinguish the dependency theory and the Prebisch-Singer approach.
Prebisch is neo-mercantilist and Keynesian and says, yes, it's possible to catch up. Dependency theory is Frank says catch up is impossible.
Yep.
How would you try it? So with the Prebisch-Singer one, so obviously being like, so you're saying if this is exactly as we just said what the thesis was before, then you're like neo-mercantilist / Prebisch-Singer Keynesian argument, and you're like, it's possible to catch up. They say it's possible to catch up, but then how again do you link that to your argument?
Through the context. So you need to pick an example.
It's possible to catch up, but it's not like.
Well, you can find a country that you think has caught up, or you can find a country that you don't think has caught up, and you can argue the point. Catch up is possible, so therefore this is, this is how you understand this question, or it's not, and then you argue the point from a different perspective.
When you were talking about liberal trade theory doesn't take, they don't identify that there is structure. Where do you identify the limitations? Do you do that through what frame of where they start their analysis? How do you identify the limitations of the theory in saying that?
I would go back to the Friedrich List reading and have a think about the difference between political and cosmopolitical economy, and the kind of assumptions that are evident in Smith's approach to understanding the cosmopolitical economy and what this means, so how this translates into contemporary understandings of the international division of labour.
I meant more as a general, kind of when you're identifying holes within a theory, especially in economics. How do you kind of look at where their sort of starting point of analysis is and then see what areas they're missing out on, or how would you?
Yep, you could look at the scope of the methodology. I mean, can you ask questions about a structure if it's only about individual countries interacting on the basis of mutually beneficial exchanges? Or you can ask things about the assumptions. But there are various ways to critique all of these approaches, usually through normative prescriptions and assumptions.
Normative prescriptions being?
What the goal is. So what is, the normative prescriptions of liberal trade theory are if you attempt to, facilitate your comparative advantage, you will create a world where everyone is increasing their production possibility frontier because everyone's specialised in the thing that they're most productive in, and so on and so on.
Oh, okay. And like free market is like the whole world will be able to
Yep.
achieve it. Okay.
Yep, yep.
No restriction.
What about section B? What question appeals to you in section B? Gold standard? Let's take a couple so I can talk broadly about the...
Gold standard, I guess that's sort of
Global imbalances, gold standard, debt crisis. Let's do the lot. Let's just do the whole section. Yeah. So okay. Let's talk practical steps. What exactly do you need to do when you leave this lecture? When you forget about the exam for 4 weeks and 6 days, the night before, the Friday night before the exam, what exactly do you need to do to prepare these responses? The first thing is figure out which questions you're going to ask or which questions you're going to respond to, and then work out which weeks those questions correspond to. And again, it's pretty easy to do given that these are variations of tutorial questions. Okay, so go and look at the week where you discuss this within tutorials. Go and look at what your wonderful peers have put up in the wiki page in terms of the class discussion notes, and then revisit the reading for that week, so whatever the tutorial reading was, and revisit the lecture that corresponds to that week. So the lecture will be the week before. So look at those 3 things. What do the tutorial discussion notes say? What does the reading say? And what do the lecture notes say? For those really diligent students who start their preparation on Thursday night, you might consider adding a couple of sources. You might consider thinking, well, what else can I use to bulk up my body of evidence, or the arguments that I'll draw upon, the things that I attempt to critically synthesize? Okay? And the third thing is you need to start thinking about what are the key themes. Okay, so you've done the reading, you've looked at the tutorial notes, what key themes present themselves here? And this is where I'll jump in, and this is where you can start to pick you can start to emphasize what's important to you, you can start to think about what you accept or what you believe is the most useful explanatory frame, and what are the sort of themes that intersect all of these questions. Section B is clearly pushing you toward the second half of the semester. Okay? We're pushing you to try and demonstrate to us how you understand the complex interaction of supranational institutions, the developments in terms of the corporate structure, so not just the structure of one particular firm, but the structure of one particular firm within the context of broader trends in corporate restructuring. And also the structure and development of the international financial system. So one, I suppose, general piece of advice. The Bretton Woods institutions, the Bretton Woods system, needs to be considered as a coherent whole as well as discretely functioning entities. So what do I mean by the Bretton Woods system when we talk about a system? So a whole that is comprised of discrete entities that function together. So what are we talking about here concretely?
When they decided to unpick the dollar, the
Yep.
US dollar from the gold standard.
When was that?
45.
So when was the US dollar unpegged, depegged, no longer pegged, uncoupled, whatever you want to say, from the value of gold? So when did the gold standard, when was it dismantled? What year? 1971. Correct. And what is the significance of this particular period? Before we get to that question, we need to know something about the gold standard itself. So what period are we talking about? The long boom, 1945 onwards. The Bretton Woods Agreement is struck in 1944. Okay, but what are the components of the Bretton Woods agreements? We have the gold standard. This, I would suggest, is the sort of foundation upon which particular institutions function to achieve certain things. What are those institutions? The International Monetary Fund. Yep, so the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs prevails until 1996. Then we have the World Trade Organization emerge out of a particular set of discussions. But it's effectively functioning in the same way. The World Bank, so it doesn't start off as the World Bank, it starts off as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then it becomes the World Bank. But this is the important point. How do we understand the function of these institutions within a broader strategic initiative? So what do these things do? What does the IMF do? Yes, so it lends money, so does the World Bank. How do we distinguish the functions of these things? Along what lines? How do we understand how they operate? So and again, we have to be specific here. In 1944, what is the ambition of the people to sit down in the United States and decide, you know what, we're going to create a set of institutions that are going to perform specific functions? Now, before we get to this, let's step aside from the sort of abstract economic theory for a second and try to put ourselves in place of these people. If you're alive in 1945 and you are anywhere between 30 to 50 years old, you have lived through, in your living memory, have occurred 3 of the most calamitous events in human history. Okay, you have lived through the Great Depression, you have lived through the First and the Second World War. You have seen, in living memory, the emergence of industrialised warfare. You have seen, for the first time, the emergence of plastic surgery because the wounds inflicted by industrial weaponry are so bad. You have seen, for the first time, and it doesn't come to be known as this for another half century, but you have seen for the first time post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, these are some of the manifestations of the horrors that were this period of history. And you were alive in this time, and the people at the helm of policy formation, economic advice, and so on, they are informed by this life experience. And they bring this with them into the discussions around Bretton Woods. And not just the people sitting at that table, but the people around the world who are very much aware of the things that they've just experienced as a society. There is this deep trauma in terms of the social fabric of many societies, and they are attempting to mitigate them. They are attempting to ensure these things don't happen again. Okay, so you have to consider the Bretton Woods institutions, the formation of that particular institutional arrangement, as a reaction to a deeply traumatic period of human history. Now, the reaction is always informed by the perceived cause. Okay, so what do you think were the perceived causes of the Great Depression, the First and the Second World War? I mean, how do we understand the Bretton Woods institutions as a reaction to these things? And this will take us some way to understanding what exactly these institutions were intended to do. So what caused the Great Depression? Or what was one of the I suppose, most significant outcomes of the Great Depression? So what happened during the Great Depression that made it so great? Yep, so there was a particular financial crash. But I mean, when you are exposed to the Great Depression for the first time in primary school or whatever it is, what are the pictures? Unemployment. Unemployment is seen as one of the great social evils of that particular time. Okay, the reparations that are imposed upon Germany after the Treaty of Versailles are seen as the causes of, or as the things that create the conditions whereby the Nazi Party can come to power and then, well, at least provide the conditions for the Second World War. Okay, so structural imbalances, stagnation in economic growth, and unemployment are perceived to be root causes of these traumatic events. The Bretton Woods institutions are a way to try and at least mitigate the formation of imbalances through addressing things like current account deficits and to promote sustained economic growth. And most importantly, within the context of an active government in relation to addressing unemployment. Okay, so when we start to think about the Bretton Woods institutions as discrete entities that are charged with specific responsibilities, we also need to think about them in how they cohere around a particular normative vision.
How do you, I find it really hard to like give a historically grounded sort of overview as to why things happen without going into a massive description of like every possible event at the time. Like how do you just be, I find it really hard to be short and succinct and not describe the whole era and happenings at that time.
Yep, again, you need to, I mean, it's a difficult question. It is hard to do, but you've always got to think about what you emphasize in relation to the question. So what are you arguing? And this is why it's so important, I think, to develop, I mean, if you're going to do one thing, you need to have your argument in mind before you turn up to the exam. Okay, do not turn up to that exam not knowing how you're going to respond to these questions. Have an opinion, a view about what exactly you think in response to these questions, and then form your argument on that basis.
Can we go through the way that you did with the other question two with section B question?
Okay, so eight. Okay, why not? Did global imbalances cause the global financial crisis of 2007-2008? No. No, and then I would survey Wolf's view about global imbalances, and I would argue that there is a particular structural tendency within the post-1970s International Division of Labour to generate the potential for imbalances. So therefore, imbalances are a symptom rather than a cause. We need to consider the types of... we need to consider the qualitative shift in the way countries integrate into an International Division of Labour, and this needs to take account of what exactly that fundamental shift was. So therefore, we need to consider the change from so-called Fordism to post-Fordism, what this means in terms of the shift in industrialisation. So formerly, the low-income countries were the source of raw materials for industrialisation in the high-income countries. From the 1970s onwards, we see an inversion of this trend in the sense that low-income countries, formerly the producers of raw materials, become industrialised and are then sending those manufactured goods to the high-income countries that were formerly the producers of those manufactured goods. How do we explain this tendency? Well, I mean, do you have 100,000 words? But for the purposes of this question, I would say that structural deficiencies within the International Division of Labour provide a better account of the global financial crisis than the global imbalances thesis forwarded by Wolf. Yeah? How'd I do? What would you give that? One more? Do I have time for one more?
Can we deconstruct that more?
Um,
Well, maybe let's do both. If no one else wants to deconstruct it.
Look, you can, but look, the specifics of that argument are contained in the thing that you critique. And I mean, this is good advice. Start with the critique and the answer will follow. If you read the Wolf article and you say, this, and this is what Wolf contends, and this, and this is what I disagree with, that will inform the finer points of the argument. Ben? 7. That is a great question. Okay. Question 7. Why did finance and financial speculation increase so rapidly in recent decades? Do you want my answer or do you want potential answers? My answer. Finance and financial speculation increased so rapidly in recent decades because traditional avenues of the expansion of capital accumulation had been exhausted in the high-income countries. If capital accumulation is contingent upon the self-expansion of value understood as socially necessary labour time, this means that the relationship between tangible goods, so the real economy, and the financial economy has always been a tenuous one. What happens from the 1970s is rates of profitability in the high-income countries decrease because of competition. So the very success of the post-war arrangements whereby the United States funneled money and technology into places like Japan and West Germany created their own competitors, and in this sense lowered the rates of profitability amongst the industrialised countries. And this effectively squeezed the ability to generate profits as more and more countries became industrialised and as more and more multinational corporations began to compete on the global stage. What this meant was that in order to ensure profitability across the board, so in order to ensure there was 3% compound growth within the global system, there needed to be another outlet of profitability. And this was the emergence of fictitious capital markets. So it is no coincidence that since the 1970s, there have been a stagnation in real wages and this huge increase in the expansion of financial markets. Because stagnating real wages, increasing prices in terms of housing and subsistence needs means something needs to fill that gap. And debt-fueled consumption was the answer. So debt-fueled consumption, inflation in property markets, and increasing competition, decreasing corporate profitability are 3 reasons why this happened. Cool. That should be plenty for you to think about. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. This has been the biggest turnout so far at all of the supplementary stuff I've given. It's good not to be just talking to 2 people in a dark room. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the exams. I will see you again beforehand. So see you later. Thank you. That's nice. It's good to feel appreciated. Hey.
Thanks for the lecture.
No worries.
Will the other lectures be the same as this, or they're going to be on different topics?
Look, it's sort of organic in the sense that whatever you ask, I will respond to. But I'm posting them all online anyway, so don't stress too much. But effectively, it's the same thing. I'm going to be saying the same.
Pretty much, yeah. Thanks.
No worries.